Hello. Yeah, and before you ask, yes, I am entitled to wear this t-shirt. In 1983, when this limited edition was produced, I was at the Cannes Film Festival, where, amongst many other things that took place, was the premiere of Oshima's then new film, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. And quite a large gang had been assembled, hence the slogan on the t-shirt, not including Kitano Takeshi, but including most of the Western actors. I don't think actually Sakamoto was there either, actually, for reasons that I can't remember. But a lot of the crew and friends of Oshima came, and it was a very convivial occasion. It was wonderful for me because I was an old friend of Oshima by this point and was very much invited into the gang and indeed given the t-shirt. So as I said, I'm entitled to wear it. It was the only occasion that I met and had a conversation with David Bowie, which was made it very memorable for me. But I was already, as I said, a friend of Oshima's and very happy to hang out with him and support him, and very pleased that the film was a success at the festival. The t-shirt, by the way, was designed by Yamamoto Kansai, then a very famous designer in Japan. Oshima had asked him to come up with something. It has Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence on the back, which we're not going to bother showing you because it's not really relevant now. But everybody agreed to wear this, usually over on the top of other clothing at the time, as I recall. But mine is little, at my age, this was a long time ago, 40 years ago, at my age, it's a little tight if I wear it on top of a shirt or anything, so I'm not doing that today. I have to say, of all the Japanese of his generation that I met, he was the one most at ease with foreigners. He was very, very happy to chat with foreigners, especially if they were interested in his work. They had some common ground that they could talk about. And he was in no way inhibited or withdrawn or bound by the sense that Japan was somehow different from other countries and that Japanese were never going to be emotionally and intimately at ease with non-Japanese, except possibly some other Asians, because that's the way it was. There is a quasi-science called Nihon Jinron, which defines or pretends to define the supposed uniqueness of the Japanese mind. Still now, if you go into a bookshop in Japan, you will find a Nihon Jinron section. And there are still lots of books being published that tell you why Japan is unique and why foreigners will never understand Japan and why Japanese and foreigners are destined never to really connect. Oshima, of course, to his huge credit, was never remotely bound by any of this dogmatic nonsense. And as I said, he was completely at ease, especially when drinking, with all kinds of groups. I've seen him in many countries. I've seen him in France, I've seen him in Scotland, I've seen him in Rome, many times in Japan, once in the United States, and he was always completely himself and completely at ease. I once saw him get angry because he'd been approached by somebody who knew nothing about his work, and he just felt it was wasting his time and kind of insulting him to approach him when this woman knew nothing about what he did or what kind of films he made. But that one occasion aside, I never saw him anything other than completely at ease in Western company. He was an enthusiastic drinker, like nothing more than sitting down to several bottles of wine or sake, depending on where he was, and sharing it with friends and becoming very convivial, very tanked up. At the same time, he was not averse to going to his favourite tailor and ordering a suit in pink or lavender. So he was something of a dandy. I think that was already true when I first met him, which would be in the early 70s, I guess. And already then he was a bit of a fancy dresser. He never dressed down. If he was going to make an appearance on a stage overseas, he would dress for the occasion, and he was a bit of a dandy. So Oshima, surprising figure, intellectually very strong, pugnacious, always open to a fight, always open to an argument, but also curiously willing to back down and find common ground when the need arises. Because he died in 2013, because he hadn't made a film since 1999, so, you know, several decades now, it's understandable that there's a generation that has grown up barely aware of Oshima. But he's somebody you absolutely should get to know. And I, for one, couldn't be more happy that Radiance Films has finally done the honours and ended the drought of Oshima on home video in Western countries. It's a long overdue moment. So I'm not going to go into huge detail about the man, the career, or anything else about him. I'll try and give some impressions, leavened with some of the anecdotes that I remember from my times meeting him in different places at different times. But let's get the basic biography out of the way first. We'll keep it very short and telegrammatically brief and terse. He's born in 1932. His father is a civil servant, but the family has samurai ancestry. They're an elite of a sort. He's brought up in the city of Kyoto, which he later confesses to everyone to hating. It's the most traditional city in many ways in Japan, possibly excepting Nara. He also went to university in Kyoto, very prestigious university, but again, he wasn't a dropout, but he was very active in student politics, became the leader of the student union, was participant in quite a number of protest actions against university behaviour, and he had no very clear idea of his future at the time that he graduated. But a friend of his, who was a big movie buff, decided to apply in Tokyo, the capital, for the entrance exam to the Shochiku Film Company. Why he chose Shochiku, it's hard to fathom, but anyway, this is 53, I think. So Oshima is 21 at the time. He decides to tag along. He has no personal great interest in film. He has had a little bit of experience of student theatre, particularly militant student theatre, because there have been some ad hoc performances of some kind on the campus to underline protest issues. So Oshima tags along to the exam in Tokyo and ends up sitting it himself and coming first. So he, having nothing better to do, he agreed to do it. And he was assigned to an assistant director's group. That was the normal thing, starting point. Assistant directors were basically supposed to help established contract directors at the studio. The most famous contract director in Shochiku at that time was Ozu. So he, along with the other and members of successes in the exam, found themselves in the assistant director's common room in Shochiku, and where they were put to work assisting established directors. In Oshima's case, not the big namers, not Ozu, not Kinoshita, but less well-known directors. And he himself has bragged that if he wasn't interested in what was assigned to him, he'd just take the day off and go home. So he was obviously not a very compliant or obedient employee of the new company. But he did busy himself much of the time writing scripts, sometimes alone, sometimes together with colleagues, friends. And like most assistant director groups in the other Japanese major companies, they published their own little magazine. And this magazine would sometimes include the scripts that they wrote. So he's publishing, at least in a very limited way, his writings. And I don't think it's known that any of the scripts that they wrote got into production, because presumably they were quite alien to the spirit of Shochiku, which is best known for home drama, so-called. I mean, very cozy family stories, suitable for family audiences, and with a certain rather conservative view of the Japanese family and how it was, how it should be, how it ideally always would be. And that was a view that Oshima himself certainly didn't share. Shochiku first puts him to work as a director by making a 7-minute promo short for the studio, because by the late 50s, by about 58, thereabouts, they are becoming aware that they're being left behind by changes in the Japanese film industry and in the Japanese film audience. So Shochiku is hiring new talents, younger talents. They're trying to promote a new generation of hot young stars to attract this new audience that is appearing around them. And who should they hire to produce a 7-minute promo introducing these people in tiny little vignettes from imaginary genre films, but Oshima, their assistant director. So his first film, technically, is a film called The Stars of Tomorrow. He was allowed, because of the success of this little short film, with a B movie. Films were still released in double bills at that time, and there was a low-budget B movie, usually in black and white, paired with an A movie, which is usually in color. Oshima was given a B movie, it's not much more than an hour long, which he wanted to call The Boy Who Sold Pigeon. But the company wouldn't have that, so they retitled it A Town of Love and Hope, which sounded very much like a typical Shochiku title, love and hope being a big thing in Shochiku land. Oshima's film was a very cynical piece. It was about a boy, a very poor boy from the wrong side of the tracks, who sells a pigeon to people in a street market. But it's a homing pigeon, and he knows perfectly well that sooner rather than later the pigeon will come back to him and he can sell it again. And he does this, and through this procedure becomes acquainted with a wealthy girl, anyway, a girl from a relatively wealthy family. And sure enough, she loses her pigeon. It flies back to him as soon as her back is turned, as it were. And she becomes resentful and has a cousin who is a rifle enthusiast shoot the bird down from the sky, leaving the boy without his sole asset. A bitter, cynical film about the impossibility of reconciling the classes, about class difference in Japan. And it shocked and appalled Hiroshido, who was the head of Shochiku at the time, and who was very much wedded to the idea that everybody should get along in the New Japan, democracy, everybody should be equal, everybody should get along, there should be no such thing as class difference. Oshima, conversely, was emphasizing class difference and pointing out very cynically and pessimistically that there was no reconciliation of the classes in sight. He was laid off for 3 months as a punishment for making this non-company line film, but by then Shochiku was becoming a bit desperate to try and change its production policies. So Oshima was given widescreen scope, color, to make his second feature, an A feature this time, which is called Cruel Stories of Youth. He followed it with a film called The Sun's Burial, which is about the slums of Osaka and a trade in illegal blood donations, and followed that with a film about the very bitter conflicts in the wake of defeat in the protests against the Japan-America Security Treaty, known as AMPO, in 1960, with a film called Night and Fog in Japan. He took the first part of the title deliberately from René's documentary about the concentration camps. This is a film about the conflicts, the very bitter and even ultimately bloody and damaging conflicts between the old left and the new left being represented by the student generation. Shochiku hated this film, not least because it was politically inappropriate for them. Actually, a socialist leader in Japan was assassinated on the very day that the film was put into Shochiku theatres, and that caused them to withdraw it from release 4 days later. So it wasn't seen for quite several years, actually. It was finally screened some years later. Oshima was aghast, of course, and horrified that his film had been censored. The company didn't like the politics, but they also didn't like the staging of the film. He'd shot it mostly in the studio. He'd centered it on a wedding ceremony, which was supposed to be a happy occasion, reunifying the two factions of the left. And far from doing that, it brought up the divisions. And he'd staged it in a very stylized way by changing lights, doing blackouts, picking out individual people in spotlights, introducing a sudden group in the background in a different light, which had never really been seen before. I don't think anybody had ever done this in any kind of movie anywhere in the world. I remember when I first saw it, I was just astonished at the staging, apart from the politics of it, and the vehemence of the film. So Oshima walks out of Shochiku after Night and Fog in Japan is banned, or pulled from the theatres anyway, by Shochiku. And he begins a decade kind of in the wilderness. Fairly quickly, he's been able to set up one independent production, an adaptation of a story by Oe Kenzaburo about an American airman, a black American airman, who is shot down over Japan and held captive in a village by a group of xenophobic villagers. He's literally confined to a pit in the village, and he ends up dead, in fact. And it's very faithful to the Oe story in many respects. And it wasn't Oshima's choice, but somebody was going to make a film based on this story because Oe was becoming famous by this time. This is long before he won the Nobel Prize. Oshima jumped at it, actually, simply because it gave him a chance to make a film, and he wanted to do that, and he liked the story also. And as you can see, it's kind of relevant in a way to what he did much later in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. Anyway, he then made his one and only film for Toei. It's a historical samurai drama. As I said, Toei was making samurai films in the 60s still. And it's called Amakusa Shiro Tokisada. I think it's usually called The Rebel Amakusa Shiro in English. Not much seen, though, which is a pity, because it's about a failed Christian rebellion in feudal Japan. But Oshima treated it as an allegory of the failure of the student movement. He was still preoccupied with that, as he had been in Night and Fog in Japan. And then it was a couple of years before he was able to make another film. During those years, he made his first trip outside Japan. He went to Korea, South Korea. Didn't take a film crew with him or anything like that. He had no money to do that, but he did take his still camera, and he came back with hundreds and hundreds of still photographs from Korea, which he later turned into a short film. He was inspired by the publication of a book in Japan called The Diary of Yun Bo-gi, ostensibly the thoughts and words of a Korean street kid. I think it was actually put together by well-meaning Japanese leftists who may or may not have had some origin in things actually said by a Korean street kid, but in any event, that was how it was presented, and it became a quite famous book in Japan, at least in leftist circles. And Oshima decided to make a short film taking texts from the book as a voiceover narration and using the still photographs he's taken of children. He'd been struck by the industry and activity of children, both, doing all kinds of street work, street jobs, shoe shining, selling newspapers, odd jobs on the street, all kinds of things. And he'd taken hundreds of photos of them, amongst other things, during his trip. And he decided to collage these photos together, and using words from the book, the Yun Bo-gi's diary book, as the voiceover for the film. Basically an incantatory spirit to the resistance and resilience of the Koreans. This was the first of a suite of films he ended up making about Koreans in Japan, because Korea was Japan's most discriminated against minority, and he became known. One of the things that made him famous, both in Japan and internationally, was the first film in which he focused on the Korean issue in Japan, which is a film called Death by Hanging. One of his most brilliant, innovative films, but also one of his most visibly committed films. A real-life sex crime inspired it, but the film is anything but a literal reconstruction of the crime or what happened after the crime. He followed that with a film called Three Resurrected Drunkards, which is about three Japanese college kids who are mistaken for illegal immigrants from Korea because illegal immigrants from Korea have stolen the clothes they left on a beach when they went swimming. So they find themselves having to put on the Korean clothes, and sure enough, immediately are arrested as suspected illegals. And he also made a film called Treatise on Japanese Bawdy Song, which is sometimes regrettably known as Sing a Song of Sex in English. I don't know who gave it that title. But the Japanese title does mean Treatise on Japanese Bawdy Song. About college kids. It stars Itami Juzo, the guy who went on to make Tampopo as a director, playing a university teacher. And it's a film which ends up in a student classroom on a campus with a lengthy demonstration by a woman lecturer, played in fact by Oshima's wife, that the Japanese race is Korean. The roots of Japan are immigrants from Korea. Before them, there were aboriginals in Japan known as the Ainu, particularly in the northern island, Hokkaido. But Japanese, as we know them in the 20th century, were originally Korean or are of Korean ancestry. This, of course, is very shocking in Japan, since Japan, hated Koreans and discriminated against them. The reason there were so many Koreans in Japan, up to 2 million at one point, although I think it went down to something like 600,000 by the time that Oshima was making these films, is that Korea had been a Japanese colony for the first half of the 20th century. From 1910 to the defeat of Japan in 1945, Japan ruled in Korea colonially and was a very oppressive colonial master. It even outlawed the Korean language at one point. It insisted that all Koreans should speak Japanese. To return to the mid-60s, Oshima is having a hard time as an independent filmmaker. There are no independent films. There's no tradition really of independent filmmaking in Japan. So he gets a few projects together, scrapes it together bit by bit, and in the mid-60s he makes a film called Ninja Bugi Icho, usually called in English Band of Ninja. It's a famous manga, a comic strip about ninja. Again, Oshima reads it, as many of the people who did buy it and read it, as an allegory, again, of the student movement. So it's that aspect that he wants to bring out. And he films it not by hiring actors or hiring animators or anything of the sort. He simply films the comic strip. It's a very dynamic filming, but he films frames from the comic strip, edits it dynamically, occasionally pans and swoops from one frame to another. It's the first ever experiment in filming a printed source as a printed source. He does add voices. As I said, he's selectively edited the text, which is over many, many volumes in the original, to bring out the allegory aspect, as I said, about the failure of the student movement, the way the student movement was outmaneuvered and defeated. This film was distributed in Japan to a limited number of art theatres by a newly formed organisation called the Art Theatre Guild. They'd had no hand in something like 12 or 14 theatres in the major cities of Japan, and decided to team up and form an association to initially help with distribution of independent films, but soon afterwards to help finance independent films as well, because it was becoming more common for directors, as Oshima had done, to leave the employment of major companies and try to strike out as independents. Distributing Ninja Bugi Icho, Band of Ninja, around Japan was a good move for the ATG, Art Theatre Guild. People wanted to see this. Students wanted to see it. People were curious to see it. Even if they'd read the manga, the original manga, they were fascinated by this weird film treatment of the books, I should say. And it did very well. So ATG was happy, Oshima was happy, audiences were happy. And that was very helpful for Oshima because it encouraged him to press on as an independent filmmaker. He made a number of films in the mid-60s. One of the films he made was about a serial killer. It's called Violence at Noon. The Japanese title means something like The Demon in Broad Daylight, something like that. It's based on the case of a real-life serial killer, a man who prowled around killing women, housewives. This, too, was a seminal film for Oshima. It did, I think, again, above-average business and distribution on the art house circuit in Japan. But it was also the film that brought home to him that up to this point he had been focusing repeatedly, film after film, on acts of crime, and in particular sexual crime. This revelation, this self-awareness that dawned at this point, continued through his subsequent work and came to dominate him. When I organised a retrospective of Oshima's films at the National Film Theatre in the early 80s for the BFI, I called it Sex, Crime, Oshima. And the head of the National Film Theatre at that time was a nice American man called Ken Lashin, who said, "You don't have to do that. This is like a cheap way of selling Oshima, like a sensationalist." I said, "It's not sensationalist at all. The films are about sex and crime. I mean, the reason it's called that is I want to alert people to the fact that if you come and see an Oshima retrospective, you're going to see films about sex and crime." And that's what it was called. And I'm pleased to say it did rather well. Oshima came to the NFT and I did a sit-down Q&A with him, which also went quite well, I think. And he was quite outspoken and quite frank in his comments about himself and his work. And altogether, it was considered a success and setting him up for future work. By this time, he was, of course, an international celebrity because he had made a film called In the Realm of the Senses, the first hardcore film to emerge from Japan. And, of course, he'd also made Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence with David Bowie and Sakamoto Ryuichi. Oshima was known for casting unlikely people in leading roles long before Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. And it was a habit he continued pretty much towards the end of his life. I mean, Gohato turned out to be his final feature film. It stars a couple of new actors, but the Shinsengumi is seen as being led by two veterans. One is Sayoichi, who is basically a director, not an actor, but also Kitano Takeshi, who has made his serious acting screen debut in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. So Oshima brings these two back to play the two senior members of Shinsengumi in Gohato, and you could call that stunt casting in a sense as well, especially since they have to deal with the homosexual scandal that breaks out in the ranks of the Shinsengumi, which of course is historically based too. I think the only director who had touched on this even briefly beforehand was Kato Tai in a film called The Downfall of the Shogunate back in the 60s. In Oshima's case, there's a clear shift towards discovering his own homosexual feelings in his later work, which I guess first surfaces explicitly in Diary of a Shinjuku Thief, but then is pretty dominant in Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, and very dominant indeed in Gohato, his final film. And when he makes a documentary for Channel 4 in Britain about 100 years of Japanese cinema, one of the films he chooses to end with, the film Clip, is a film that nobody really remembers anymore, but it was one of Japan's first gay features, a film called Twinkle, directed by Matsuoka Joji, about a triangle, a gay couple of men and the woman who comes between them to some degree, and how they achieve a ménage à trois kind of reconciliation at the end of the film, a new way of living in Japanese terms. So Oshima was, increasingly explicitly and openly drawn to gay issues, gay feelings, gay sentiments, questions of gender identity and so on. In the case of Diary of a Shinjuku Thief, ahead of the curve, long before people started talking about bisexuality and pansexuality. So, Oshima begins an association with, he resumes an association with Shochiku. Shochiku agrees to co-fund and distribute some of his later 60s films. And ATG, which has very little money, agrees to do others. And some he sets up himself. Diary of a Shinjuku Thief is completely a production of his own company, made on a shoestring, shot I think on 16mm, and made very, very cheaply. Hardly anyone would have been paid for it, I think. Others had slightly higher budgets, like The Ceremony, Dear Summer Sister, his Okinawa film. The Man Who Left His Will on Film, which is the last one of that series in black and white, it was also made extremely cheaply for Sozosha Creation Company, his own company. So that's the middle period of Oshima's career. He quits. After Dear Summer Sister, he decides it's too arduous to go on making films in these no-budget conditions or very, very low-budget conditions, and he takes time off. In the 60s, he had made a lot of documentaries for television. This time, he starts working for television, and he starts hosting a daytime TV program called The School for Wives, in which he does interviews with anonymized women, middle-aged women in Japan, about their frustrations, their personal private feelings, their marriages, their sex lives, anything that interests them, but inevitably focusing mostly on their frustrations. It's because of this that he goes on to make Kyoto My Mother's Place, because he suddenly became aware, after talking to so many women in the TV show, that most women in Japan were very deeply frustrated and unhappy, and begins to think, oh, my mother must have been like that too. And indeed, she was. I mean, her friends all testify to it. So he does that for a couple of years, then gets the opportunity unexpectedly because of porno chic in the West, because America has turned porno, or at least the major cities in America have turned liberal towards porno. Deep Throat, Devil in Miss Jones, all of these films become chic films to go and see, even for non-porno hounds. The same happens in France, in Paris. There's a sudden wave of French hardcore filmmaking. And a French Jewish producer called Anatole Daumont, who has a very distinguished track record, has worked with many of the major names in French cinema, decides he'd like a piece of this action and wants to produce porno films, arty porno films. Daumont starts thinking about more innovative approaches to arty porno filmmaking. He knows, because they bought films from him for release in Japan, a woman called Kawakita Kazuko and her partner Hayao Shibata, who have this company called France Film Company. So anyway, they are approached by Monsieur Daumont saying he would like to make an explicit, hardcore pornographic film in Japan with a Japanese filmmaker. Who would they propose? And they immediately thought of Oshima. As I said, by this time Oshima was well known, at least in Japanese film circles, for focusing on sex and crime. And the making of such a film would itself be a sex crime, because Japanese censorship explicitly forbid any full nudity in Japanese films. You could suggest pretty much any sex act you like. You could have the actors fake it, or you could even have them do it for real, as long as you masked it and blocked it in some way to prevent audiences seeing it explicitly. So they put it to Oshima, who was initially aghast at the thought. It took 2 years to come round to it, but eventually said he'd been thinking about it a lot. He'd talking about it with his friends, and had come to the conclusion this was quite an interesting idea. So they would shoot the film in Japan. They would process it in France, where it would not be subject to the same legal restrictions. They would edit the film in France, and they would then try to release it globally. Well, I don't think you need me to tell you that this was a huge success. The film was a sensation in Cannes the year it premiered there. I was there that year also, and I remember the riots on the Rue d'Antilles. The film played not in the main festival, but in the Director's Fortnight subsection, which its main cinema was the cinema on the Rue d'Antilles. Its plate glass doors were broken down at one of the screenings, the 15th or 16th repeat screening. It had to be endlessly repeated because of the huge demand by the crowd pressing against the plate glass doors off the street. So it was a sensation in Japan, and it was widely sold around the world, and it was distributed widely as well. Daumont wanted, of course, another one soon afterwards, and Oshima made a second film for him. It's known as Empire of Passion, Aino Bore in Japanese. Empire of Passion was the exact opposite of In the Realm of the Senses. Oshima had become known by this time for not repeating himself. If you look at Oshima's filmography, especially if you go to a retrospective of some kind, and it will be true if you just look at the films on this Blu-ray set, you'll notice that each film is radically different in form, style, pace, rhythm, and visual approach from the one before and the one after. Oshima had a horror of repeating himself. He came up with a style that he deemed appropriate to each film in turn. So one film might be shot in standard ratio black and white, Death by Hanging, for example, and it would be very soon afterwards followed by a film like Boy, which is shot in colour and widescreen scope. Death by Hanging is composed, it's quite Brechtian in a way. Captions appear on the screen all the way through. There's a lot of direct address to the audience. Questions are asked of the viewer. It's chaptered in ways that announce what's coming up so that nobody is taken by surprise by anything. And it's composed mostly of very short bits and pieces, sometimes of surprisingly long takes, but shot entirely in the studio, so it has a completely artificial feel at all times. Boy, on the other hand, is shot entirely on location across Japan, in many cities in Japan, and part of the reason for doing it like that, and part of the reason for shooting it in colour and scope, is that Oshima wanted to show off the locations because it would, in a curious way, ground the criminal activity that the film shows. The criminal activity in this case being two renegade parents who specialise in feigning traffic accidents with their young son, their 10-year-old son. They illustrate the point I'm trying to make, that Oshima has spent his entire career, from film to film, reacting against what he has just done. He has done something different in form, shape, even screen ratio from the film he made before. So no stylistic signature. There is nothing you can call the Oshima style. He deliberately avoided having one, in fact. Each film is conceived according to a schema that he arrives at based on his understanding of the subject. And no two of them are exactly alike. So this means that after making The Diptych for Daumont, he makes few more films. Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence should have set him up to do international films, more than it actually did. He spent a long time trying to develop a Hollywood project, which would have been another gay film. It was going to be called Hollywood Zen, and it was being based on the real-life relationship between Rudolph Valentino in the 1920s and the sole Japanese star of Hollywood films at that time, Sesshu Hayakawa, who apparently did have some kind of sexual relationship during the 1920s, and Oshima was very keen to blow away the cobwebs and reveal this for what it was. There was quite a lot of interest in it, but the film went through a number of script drafts, and there were apparently quite a few big-name actors who were quite keen to play in it, but never happened. And one of the reasons it never happened is that the financing never quite came into place. This was a little early to be financing a gay-themed film in America. And after he made a film in Paris called Max Mon Amour, working together with Jean-Claude Carrière, Buñuel's late scriptwriter or co-writer of most of Buñuel's later films, and the film was somehow received as a disappointment by many reviewers at the time, because they all said, oh, it's sub-Buñuel. This is the kind of thing Buñuel used to do, because they picked up on the fact that Carrière wrote it or co-wrote it. I think it fits in rather well with late Oshima's interests and schema, and I think it's a perfectly valid film to have made and a perfectly decent addition to the canon of Oshima works. The sad thing is that before he could parlay any success from this film into getting Hollywood Zen financed, he suffered a stroke in 1996, just a few years after making Max Mon Amour. He was in fact in Heathrow Airport at the time. He was in transit. He was rushed from the airport to Charing Cross Hospital, where Jeremy Thomas, the producer of Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, took charge of looking after him, making sure that he was looked after as best possible. And he had treatment for quite a long time in Charing Cross Hospital. I'm ashamed to say I didn't go to visit him, but I would have felt embarrassed, I think. I felt it was a kind of private matter, and I didn't feel we were close enough to each other for me to intrude on his hospital bed, especially when he was not in the best of shape. Anyway, he was eventually shipped back to Japan. The way it was found he recovered sufficiently to do that, where he went through long periods of physiotherapy. He was basically confined to a wheelchair, but through self-will, he determined to improve his physical condition. And as I mentioned earlier, I visited the shoot of Gohato in Kyoto in the late 1990s. And although he was basically confined to a wheelchair, but when the actual shooting took place, he would get up from the wheelchair and stand and even take a few hesitant steps forward to direct the actors, to behave as he had spent a lifetime doing as a director. And I was very impressed by that. And for him, it was clearly a matter of pride and determination to do this. Sadly, though, after Gohato, he suffered further strokes, minor ones, but it kept happening. His body was rebelling, I guess, against a lifetime of heavy drinking. Sadly, Gohato proved to be the last film he was able to direct. He had been, though, for many years, chair of the Japanese Directors Guild. In his role, he did things like conduct ceremonial interviews with veteran directors for the Guild. Kurosawa is the most famous one. Oshima had been very scornful about Kurosawa in his youth, and Kurosawa only gets one short clip, and that's from a very early film. It's one of his first post-war films in Oshima's documentary about Japanese cinema. Even Rashomon and Seven Samurai only get a still each. So he's not in no way beholden to the masters in this sense. This is not a documentary based on exaggerated respect for the great figures. But in his role as Directors Guild chairman, he conducted the Guild's official interview with Kurosawa, which entailed going to Kurosawa's place and sitting for 2 hours with him and conducting a career interview over those 2 hours. What I haven't said about Oshima, and what I think you need to know as well, I've tried to stress that he started out as a leftist, very much preoccupied by the internecine struggles on the left, but particularly the old left and the new left. From the mid-70s onwards, from In the Realm of the Senses onwards, Oshima frequently made films about characters who turned their backs on politics. He'd done that right at the beginning. I mean, back in the days of Cruel Story of Youth, you see kids passing down the streets of Tokyo and trampling on banners and painted slogans and so on, which had been carried there only a few moments earlier by demonstrators. But in the Realm of the Senses, for example, Kichi and Sada, the central couple, basically retreat into a world of their own. Their relationship is built on fantasy, and just like the boy in Boy retreats into his own fantasies, and the film becomes increasingly impossible as that film goes on to distinguish what is real from what he is imagining. So the same happens in the Realm of the Senses. The film has shifted increasingly into the fantasies of living in a world apart from the real one. They are the prototype of characters who are disengaged from political concerns. They have no political awareness. On the contrary, they pursue their own fantasies to the end. And for Oshima, this is itself a political decision. So his cinema marks a retreat from explicit politics, or political engagement anyway, and chronicling the failures of politics, which he has repeatedly done, to looking at people who have chosen to exist outside politics, or to try to exist outside politics, Usually a frustrating process, but nonetheless an important one, and one that he sees as being symptomatic of present-day Japan.